Hi guys, welcome to A Daily Change of Mind. I'm Stephen Clemens. Today is January 29th, 2019. And today we're still going to be in the He is Risen series, looking at the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And what I thought I would bring to you today is concerning the trial of Jesus Christ before he went to the cross. I believe that Jesus Christ, the trial of Jesus Christ was the greatest trial in all of human history. And I thought we would look at that today and see how far I can get through it today. So I'm going to be reading to you again. I know how much y'all like me reading to you. So I'm going to read something to you, and I'm going to try to get as far as I can. If not, if I don't get through it all, then we'll pick it up again, and I'll finish it out for you. So, it's titled, The 12 Reasons Why Jesus' Trial Was Illegal. Have you ever considered that even by man's laws, Jesus' trial was illegal? And here are 12 reasons. Starts off, it is just after midnight on the Passover. An ominous gathering of people wielding swords and clubs has assembled in the midst of Jesus and his disciples on the Mount of Olives. Their intent mostly unknown. A man named Judas steps forward from the multitude and greets Jesus with a kiss, saying, "Good evening, Master." Jesus responds, "My friend, why are you here tonight?" Immediately, several members of the large crowd move forward and seize Jesus, prompting one of his disciples to grab a sword and strike one of the attackers. "Put down your sword," Jesus exclaims. "It is of no value. Those who rely on swords will die with their sword in hand. They are of no use. If I wanted to, I could call upon my Father to send more than 70,000 angels to free me. But if this were to happen, the scriptures would not be fulfilled." Then Jesus says to the crowd, "Why have you seized me tonight with swords and clubs, as if I were a criminal? Did you not see me many times teaching in the temple? Why did you not lay hands upon me then?" At that very moment, Jesus' disciples, his close friends, who have been with him for the better part of 3.5 years, flee and forsook him. Every last one of them forsook him, as it is written, "I will smite the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock shall be scattered abroad." Matthew 26:31. Jesus is eventually taken to the place of the high priest, whose name is Caiaphas. There, a sizable group of scribes and Pharisees is anxiously assembled. For years, Jesus' popularity among the common people of Judea had threatened their position of authority. Now they finally have a chance to try Jesus and convict him of a crime, one punishable by death. You are probably at least somewhat familiar with the rest of the story. Jesus is tried, convicted, and put to death, crucified on a stake. But have you ever closely examined the court proceedings leading to Jesus' crucifixion? Have you considered that even by man's laws, Jesus' trial was illegal? Now we're going to look at the commonly held views of the trial. Many believe and try to prove that Jesus was legally put to death. For example, in his 1916 book, The Prosecution of Jesus, Richard Wellington Husband, a lawyer, wrote, quote, "The arrest was legal. The hearing by the Sanhedrin was legal. The course of the trial in Rome, in the Roman court, was legal. The conviction was legal and was justified." And here's how Husband supports his assertions. Quote, The arrest was legal, for it was conducted by the proper officers, acting under instruction from the Sanhedrin. There was no illegality in the circumstances under which the arrest was effected. The hearing by the Sanhedrin was legal, for it was merely a preliminary hearing and was not a formal trial. The course of the trial in the Roman court was legal, for it harmonized with the procedure shown in the sources to be pursued by governors of provinces in hearing criminal cases. End of quote. Quote, the conviction was legal and was justified provided the evidence was sufficient to substantiate the charges and the records do not prove the contrary. End of quote. As you can see, according to Husband, the entire process leading to the death of Christ was legal. And to him, the Bible does not provide sufficient evidence to indicate otherwise, as he states that other, quote, records do not prove the contrary. Similarly, another author, Max Radin, a former professor and author of the book The Trial of Jesus of Nazareth, believes the accounts in the Bible are not credible, since Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were not physical eyewitnesses to the secretive proceedings. In his book, Radin claims there is no clear statement of how the knowledge of the trial came to those who reported it. End of quote. The author, however, does not take into account the possibility that Christ could have explained everything to his disciples when he was resurrected from the dead. Jesus was a personal eyewitness to the trial and could have accurately conveyed everything to his followers to record in the pages of the Bible. Of course, the author, Radin, also does not believe that Scripture is inspired. Later in the book, Radin provides insight into a common trial in Judea during Christ's time. He says, quote, We are most of us familiar with the procedure of criminal investigations. The accused person is arrested, arraigned before a committing magistrate, specifically accused and formally tried. He may, and he generally does, appeal to a higher court if he is convicted. All of these things, pay attention, all of these things take time, and there is almost necessarily an interval of weeks and months between the later stages of the procedure. But above all, the procedure is strictly regulated by law, and any serious deviation is not merely an irregularity, but will probably prevent punishment from being inflicted. That's why it takes weeks to months to do. By the above description alone, Jesus' trial was fraudulent. All of the above mentioned events take time, and usually lots of it. Again, weeks to months. Radin himself admits this, yet the trial of Jesus was completed in about 9 hours after he was arrested. Have you ever heard of such a thing? Someone being arrested and within 9 hours being sentenced to death. And due to the privacy of the proceedings, there were no witnesses to testify on the behalf of Jesus. There were probably many witnesses to testify against him. How many court cases are you aware of that are similar to this? Probably none. Several pages later in the book, Radin attempts to reconcile his description of a lengthy criminal investigation with Jesus' 9-hour process. He says, quote, Mark's version, even by his own testimony, cannot be more than a guess. Instead of a hurried night meeting, a harsh and brief interrogatory, a disregard of established rules of evidence and procedure, the trial may have been formally correct and the judge formally correct even from the point of view of an upright judge, just though severe. End of quote. As is the case with most scholars, Radin dismisses the Bible as a source of historically accurate information. He assumes that Mark guessed what may have happened, and as such, believes the investigation would have occurred some other way. Yet the accounts of the Bible are the only sources of information that cover the trial. One cannot justify his position based on another source. He can merely render a guess or an assumption. When one believes what was written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, only one conclusion can be drawn. Christ's trial was illegal even by men's standards. Again, I want to get as far as I can with this. If you don't get it all, listen to this message again. I find this very fascinating. I've always kind of liked criminal investigation documentaries and things like that. I don't know why, but I always have. So this one really fascinates me. Especially, we're talking about the Savior of the entire world and the criminal trial that he went through. Anyhow, next section is called, What's the Charge? Some might wonder, why did the Jews deliver Jesus to the Romans to be killed? Could they not have put him to death themselves? A common view is that the Jews did not have the authority to execute criminals. Continuing in the prosecution of Jesus, Husbands states, quote, according to the common view, the right to try capital cases, cases involving the death penalty, and even the right to pronounce sentences still rested with the Sanhedrin. But the actual penalty could not be inflicted until the governor had given his sanction. Those who believed Jesus' adversaries had no legal basis to execute him usually cite John chapter 18, verse 31, where Pilate, the Roman governor, said to the Jews, quote, take you him and judge him according to your law. The Jews therefore said unto him, it is not lawful for us to put any man to death. So that's where they get the idea that the Jews have no authority to put anybody to death. Lifted from its context, the verse does appear to indicate that the Jews were unable to execute criminals. Yet the truth is that they did have the power to try, convict, and execute people, except in cases that involved treason or sedition against the Roman government. Consider the following. Stephen was accused of blasphemy and as a result was stoned to death by the Jewish authority. As described in the book of Acts, chapter 6, verse 11, and chapter 7, verse 59. The Romans were not consulted in this execution, and there is no indication that they disapproved. On several occasions, the scribes and Pharisees sought to kill Jesus. I said that before when we were looking at who the claims of Christ, what he claimed about himself. We saw many times that they sought to kill him. And you can see that in Mark chapter 11, verse 18, Mark 14, verse 1, Luke chapter 19, verse 47, Luke 22, verse 2, John chapter 10, verse 31. And if this were illegal, it is doubtful that they would have even attempted to do so. In one instance, elders of Judea brought before Jesus a woman who had been caught committing adultery, and said, quote, now Moses and the law have commanded us that such should be stoned, but what do you say? Or what say you, Jesus? In John chapter 8, verse 5. If the Jews did not have authority to put this woman to death, Jesus might have replied, aren't you aware, quote, aren't you aware of Roman law? You don't have the power to execute anyone, end of quote. But he didn't. He simply said, quote, he that is without sin among you, let him first cast a stone at her, end of quote. And that's in verse 7 of John 8. Jesus knew full well that the Jews were legally able to execute adulteresses and criminals. Also, if it were not legal for Jews to perform executions, consider what might have happened if the word of this event reached Roman authority. Surely, if such were the case, the Jews would not have been so public about it. Finally, the Apostle Paul was stoned by a crowd in Asia, among whom were Jews. Wherever the Jews settled during the time of Roman rule, they had legal right to execute people under their law. So then, what is the statement in John 18, verse 31 referring to? John 18, verse 31, what is this referring to? And it says that it is not lawful for us to put any man to death. From the earliest period, the Roman governor took cognizance of all matters that had relation to the public security or the majesty of the empire. Consequently, there was not a time at which the Roman magistrate would not step in when a charge of treason was made or a seditious movement began. The case against Jesus is one especially in point, for the charge against him, treason, could under no circumstances be tried by any tribunal except that of the governor. The Roman government would only intervene in criminal affairs when the matters of treason, civil disobedience, incitement to revolution, or attacks against Caesar were involved. Otherwise, local administration was conducted by local officials and the regular courts of the conquered nations. Roman authorities were not involved in every criminal proceeding throughout the vast empire. Jesus' opponents accused him of blasphemy, but since they did not want to execute him themselves, they created charges of treason against him. This way, the trial could be brought before Pontius Pilate, and in their minds, the Jews, the Sanhedrin, he and the Romans would be responsible for Jesus' death, not them. Let's see, what time is it? It is 11:51. I'll try to get through it as far as I can here. Now we're going to look at the events leading to Jesus' death. Before identifying the precise reasons Jesus' trial was illegal, it will be helpful to briefly examine events leading up to his crucifixion. We begin with Judas Iscariot striking a deal with religious authorities. Turn real quick to Luke. Luke chapter 22. You can find this also in the other gospel records, but Luke chapter 22. See here. Luke chapter 22, verse 1. Now the feast of unleavened bread drew nigh, which is called the Passover. And the chief priests and scribes sought how they might kill him, for they feared the people. Then entered Satan into Judas, surnamed Iscariot, being of the number of the 12. And he went his way and communed with the chief priests and captains how he might betray him unto them. And they were glad and covenanted to give him money. And he promised and sought opportunity to betray him unto them in the absence of the multitude. Soon after Judas entered into a pact with the religious leaders, Jesus and his faithful disciples ate their final meal together on Passover evening. And you can see that also in chapter 22 of Luke. And after they eat the meal together on the Passover evening, then Judas arrived at the Mount of Olives with a large mob of various people, including Jesus' future judges and jury, who stirred up the mob to arrest Jesus. And you can see that from all the way from Luke chapter 22, verse 8, through all the way to verse 39. you'll see that's whenever you see Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. He asks his disciples to pray, watch and pray. They end up falling asleep. And Jesus, let's just look at it real quick in chapter 22, verse 46. And he said unto them, Jesus saying, Why sleep ye? Rise and pray, lest ye enter into temptation. And as he was speaking, in verse 47 it says, While he yet spake, behold, a multitude behold, a multitude, and he that was called Judas, one of the 12, went before them and drew near unto Jesus to kiss him. But Jesus said unto him, Judas, betray thou the Son of Man with a kiss. And you can see, and if you continue on reading, and when they were about him, saw what would follow, they said unto him, Lord, shall we smite with the sword? And one of them smote the servants of the high priest and cut off his ear. And Jesus said unto him, Suffer ye thus far. And he touched his ear and healed them. Then Jesus said unto the chief priests and captains of the temple, and the elders which were come to him, Be ye come out against a thief with sword and staves? When I was daily with you in the temple, ye stretched forth no hands against me. But this is your hour and the power of darkness. Then they took him and led him and brought him to the high priest's house, and Peter followed far off. And continue on reading from this article. After their arrest, a former high priest named Annas examined Jesus first. And you can see that in John chapter 18. It might take me a little bit to get through this section of this He is Risen series of the trial of Jesus, but I think it's worth the trip. John chapter 8 verse 13, they led him away to Annas first, for he was father-in-law to Caiaphas, which was the high priest that same year. Next, the mob brought Jesus to the high priest's palace, where Caiaphas, the high priest, and the Sanhedrin were gathered. And you can see that in Matthew 26, chapter 26. Got a little bit of time. I'm about to have to wrap it up here, but we'll look at this final one. Like I said, I'll pick this up next time and get to I'm just going to give you the verses, the chapter and verses, and you can read it for yourself. So I can get to a stopping point here, and we'll pick this back up. Let me reread this. After the arrest, a former high priest named Annas examined Jesus first. We saw that. That's John chapter 18, verse 13. Next, the mob brought Jesus to the high priest's palace, where Caiaphas, the high priest, and the Sanhedrin were gathered together. That's in Matthew chapter 26, verse 57 through 58. Here, numerous false witnesses came before the Sanhedrin to give testimony against Jesus. Eventually, Christ was condemned to death, apparently on the charge of blasphemy. That's also in Matthew chapter 26, verses 65 through 66. The next morning, the Sanhedrin formally condemned Jesus in an attempt to make the previous evening's procedure legal. A multitude of people then led Jesus to Pilate. You can see that in Luke 23, verse 1, and pronounced different charges, not blasphemy that they charged him with the night before, pronounced different charges, saying, We have found this fellow perverting the nation and forbidding to give tribute to Caesar, saying that he himself is Christ, a king. You see that in Luke 23, verse 2. Notice that they did not accuse Christ of blasphemy in front of Pilate. Instead, they charged him with treason against the Roman Empire. And that's where I'm going to have to stop for today. I will continue this on, and we'll do it until we get through this whole thing. But I think this is just fascinating to me. And not only that, it proves that Jesus was innocent not just by the claims that he made about himself, that he was telling the truth, but also that like I said previously in the previous messages, that the Pharisees and all of them could not find anything at fault with Jesus. They could not rebuke him in any way or find anything false about what Jesus Christ was saying. They have to concoct a reason to be able to convict Jesus. Like I just read to you. When they brought him to the high priest Caiaphas, they charged him with blasphemy. But when they brought him before Pilate, they didn't charge him with blasphemy. They charged him with treason against Caesar. They had to concoct a story, make up a story, or make up a charge against Jesus in order to convict him. Not based upon blasphemy. I just find this fascinating, and I thought it would be something that would be interesting to bring in this series before we get into the actual death and crucifixion, or the beatings and the crucifixion of Jesus Christ and the burial and all that. I thought I would bring this information to you. So that's my message for today. Again, this is kind of like an introduction into this topic concerning Christ, the trial that he went through. The greatest trial in the history of mankind, which had the greatest implications of any trial that affected all of humanity. Which proves forth that he was truly the unblemished lamb brought forth to the slaughter to make atonement for all of our sins once and for all. So that's my message today. If you like it, comment, share it, subscribe to it, share this video with others. Let's keep our eyes focused on Jesus. Let's continue to pray for each other. If you have any prayer requests that you would like to send in to me, I'll keep it private unless you don't want it private. And I will pray for you as well. So that's my message for today. I hope you're interested and you stick around and you take this trip with me through this topic of the trial of Jesus Christ before we move on to other topics. So with that, I'll see y'all later.